While much of the world was perhaps understandably focused on the US decision to very publicly yoink Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro, another parallel effort had already been playing out against other, arguably more valuable Venezuelan-linked assets, oil tankers. Just over the course of the second half of December, the United States had already seized 5 tankers accused of carrying sanctioned oil, and even after the involuntary leadership shuffle in Caracas, the numbers of involved tankers have continued to climb, as have the diplomatic stakes, with, for example, Russia taking one sanctioned tanker under its legal protection and dispatching naval vessels to escort it, only for the United States to call the bluff and go ahead and seize it anyway. All this marks a significant escalation in US actions against the so-called Shadow Fleet. Just as Ukraine continues its own complementary kinetic sanctions campaign against Shadow Fleet tankers operating in a very different part of the world. And so today, I want to look at what's sometimes been called the tanker war, from how the Shadow Fleet came to be so large and so important to countries like Russia, Iran and Venezuela, to what the strategic implications might be if, especially for these ships, the classic rights of freedom of navigation of the seas suddenly weren't so free. To do that, I'll start by giving a brief introduction to freedom of navigation, the process of sanctions, and why the Shadow Fleet exists. Then I'll look at the so-called US blockade of Venezuela, asking questions about its effectiveness, its intent, some reasons it may or may not be legal, and whether it's even a blockade. We'll then move on to how countries like Russia appear to be responding to the US effort, and the effects of what Ukraine is trying to do against the Shadow Fleet half a world away. Then to close, we'll zoom out for some more strategic level questions. That includes the economics of these operations and why it can really sting even if you're only talking about a relatively small number of tankers, and what it might mean for international trade and maritime assumptions as a whole, if the United States Navy, which historically has been a massive guardian of freedom of navigation at sea, in the future potentially decides that it's more like a privilege than a freedom. Okay, so before we dive into how the tanker wars are playing out, let's start by understanding the Shadow Fleet itself, why it exists, why the US might prefer it didn't, and how that led to where we are now. The starting point here is that the Shadow Fleet, as we call it, is a response to international sanctions, but a specific type of sanction. When we're talking about these ships that might be carrying Venezuelan, Iranian, or Russian oil, what they're doing, in the international law sense, isn't usually strictly illegal, and the sanctions we're talking about are placed by individual nations. This isn't, for example, a case of an arms embargo put in place by the UN Security Council, where every member state is meant to enforce those restrictions. Instead, in this case, we're normally talking about sanctions and restrictions put in place by the United States and its various allies around the world. And contrary to the occasional bit of fiery rhetoric you might hear out of various political capitals, no one actually owns the high seas. And so the way sanctions placed by various states normally work isn't by targeting the ships themselves in international waters, it's by refusing to provide permissions and services. You refuse to provide them insurance, a big deal since the overwhelming majority of global merchant tonnage is insured by Western firms. You deny them the ability to dock in your ports, travel through your territorial waters, to access repair and support services, and generally make life as economically inconvenient and difficult as possible by just refusing to do it any favours. Even if only some countries are placing those sanctions, this can still be a very effective process because international shipping and the industry and services that support it are generally very globally distributed. The classic soundbite here would be that international shipping is built in Asia, owned in Greece, insured in Britain, flagged to Panama, Liberia or the Marshall Islands, and then ultimately ends up recycled in Bangladesh, India or Pakistan. That's not strictly as true now as it once was. I believe all Asian companies combined now own more deadweight tonnage than the Greeks do, but the general concept here is that if you're a sanctioning major power, there's lots of different pain points in the ecosystem you can potentially go after. There's plenty of ways to define the Shadow Fleet then, but they will almost universally try and avoid registration in sanctioning countries, avoid port calls in sanctioning countries, seek their insurance elsewhere. They might potentially hop between various flags of convenience fairly regularly, all to facilitate their primary or one of their primary goals, which is transporting sanctioned or restricted products. A lot of these ships are not in great condition. They tend to be older hulls, a lot of which were scheduled for retirement or scrapping before they were picked up by opportunistic traders who saw an opportunity to run one last hurrah, carrying sanctioned oil or other products that more reputable shipping firms might not consider. Between Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and other related actors, just how big the Shadow Fleet is really depends on whose estimates you take, and more importantly, what kind of ships you count. The estimates you see on the right there are from S&P Global, dated August 2025, which is really only counting the medium and very big stuff. Oil tankers running from about 30,000 tonnes capacity on the low end, up to 200,000 plus on the high end. By their count, at this point there were 561 of those larger tankers linked to Russia, 170 to Iran, 54 to Venezuela, and 193 that served multiple countries. Total capacity across the board, more than 110 million deadweight tonnes. The most common size category here were the so-called Aframax tankers, which are ships with a deadweight of between 80 and 120,000 metric tons that can generally serve most ports around the world and are going to carry about 600,000 barrels of oil each. So not the super tankers that might carry millions of barrels, but still a fairly hefty ship. Broaden what you include in the definition a bit wider, and you can also get estimates like this one, again from late 2025, which estimated the total shadow fleet globally at about 3,200 vessels. For sanctioned countries, what the shadow fleet can potentially allow them to do is try and get their sanctioned oil exports out to the market, and in Russia's case, try and avoid the price caps when doing so. If they want to sell that crude to a buyer at a price higher than the one that the Europeans or the United States have set down, then they're going to need to find transportation for it that doesn't care about the price cap, and the shadow fleet for years has been it. That said, building a massive armada of oil-carrying vessels that tend to be very old, poorly maintained, without access to regular insurance, maintenance, inspection, or most port facilities, does sometimes come with a few drawbacks. These ships can be prone to both accidents and also genuine accidents. And one of the tools that Europeans in particular have found to try and tackle these vessels, especially within their own territorial waters, is actually to essentially try and strangle them with environmental red tape. A lot of these tankers aren't going to meet environmental and safety requirements, and especially if you're operating in European waters, trying to avoid anyone's maritime jurisdiction is geographically a bit difficult. So what we've seen happen before is the Europeans inspect a vessel, cite it for environmental breaches, and use that as a way to take a shadow fleet tanker off the board. The UK and some other countries have also been big fans of dialing up insurance checks. It was recently reported that more than 600 ships had been stopped while sailing close to the British Isles, and a recent UK claim is that actions by the various allies against the shadow fleet, including these kind of measures, have already forced about 200 ships off the water. While that approach of weaponising regulation can be very funny, it's also ultimately very limited. As a nation-state, you only get to enforce your environmental rules within certain waters. You don't get to go out onto the high seas, where these tankers are going to spend a lot of their time, and try and enforce them there. The German Navy can't intercept a freighter full of oversized fuel-hungry pickup trucks, cite them for not meeting emission standards, and then storm the ship. But that kind of concept, stretching enforcement action well beyond your own waters, is exactly what sets some of the recent US efforts apart. Which gets us to Venezuela, where the US, very obviously, has been going after ships in international, not American territorial waters. A lot of this traces back to an announcement we saw from Donald Trump on December 16th, which we'll come back to in a moment because the details matter, but which indicated the US was going to be going after sanctioned oil tankers. And the following weeks, the US would track down and board multiple tankers carrying sanctioned Venezuelan oil, which led to a lot of commentators very quickly trying to get clarification on what exactly the US was trying to do here and whether or not it might be legal. On that legality point, there's really two ways to address the question. The perspective that understandably got a lot of attention in the US media specifically was whether or not this whole exercise was going to get the legal green tick from the US legal system. Here there are debates about extraterritoriality, the warrants, the search processes, but from the perspective of the kind of things we tend to focus on this channel, the strategic, the geopolitical implications of stuff like this, I have a very nuanced piece of legal analysis to contribute to the argument. It doesn't really matter to us that much compared to some of the other factors involved. From a strategic perspective, as far as other countries are concerned, understanding the domestic laws of a country like the United States, Russia, the People's Republic of China can be useful to the extent that it helps you try and predict their behaviour or gives you a tool that you can use, but at the same time, countries' laws can be changed, they can be ignored, and there are plenty of cases where countries can write almost whatever they want into their domestic law books without it really constraining their strategic options. Article 353 of the Russian Criminal Code, for example, makes planning, preparing, unleashing, or waging an aggressive war punishable by multiple years in prison. And yet we haven't yet seen any of the Russian generals engaged in planning or waging an aggressive war against Ukraine arrested, sentenced, only to then presumably be later released when they agreed to join the Russian army in exchange for having their sentences dropped. If they wanted to, there's nothing stopping North Korea passing a domestic law banning anyone in the territory of the United States owning a firearm. But without an extraterritorial enforcement mechanism, it's strategically irrelevant, and I doubt most Americans would even notice. Domestic law can be strategically relevant, but normally when someone is describing an action like this as legal or illegal, they're talking about it from an international law standpoint. And at least based on what little commentary I've seen by experts so far, noting I'm not one in this area, in this case, a lot might come down to what the United States is actually trying to do, and in particular, whether we're going to go by their announcements or the specific actions we've actually seen. Let me explain. In his December 16th post on Truth Social, President Trump used a very specific term, blockade, saying that, quote, "Therefore today I am ordering a total and complete blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers going into and out of Venezuela," end quote. A blockade is a specific type of military operation and a relatively precise legal term. Blockades are generally a feature of a war. They're recognised as an act of aggression under international law. One definition is that a blockade is a belligerent operation to prevent vessels and or aircraft of all nations, enemy and neutral, from entering or exiting specified ports, airports or coastal areas belonging to or occupied by or under the control of an enemy nation. Historically and legally, they tend to have a range of common features, some of which we'll get into a little bit later on. But a core point is that a blockade is a fairly forceful measure, and often a differentiating factor between one and less extreme measures is going to be the use of military rather than just legal force. If me and Damo run competing pubs and I say anyone who goes to his place is no longer welcome at mine, that's a legal barrier. If I go stand out the front of his pub with a shotgun, threatening to shoot anyone who goes through the door, that's closer to a blockade. A good historical example of a blockade in action might be the actions of the Royal Navy during World War I, where soon after the fighting started, the Royal Navy essentially fanned out, set up standoff blockade lines, and essentially told any merchant ship that was thinking about going to Germany that they should really reconsider. With most commercial opportunities in Germany presumably not being worth the risk of taking a 6 or a 12-inch shell, merchant traffic into German ports other than from safe havens like the Baltic basically fell off a cliff. And as the war dragged on, the stage was ultimately set for the strangulation of the German economy and the growing hunger of its population. The 21st century has seen a number of blockades or embargoes that are enforced by military patrols, but often the legal basis for those is going to be some form of international authorization. Nations could inspect and board ships to enforce the arms embargo against Libya, for example, because UN Security Council 1973 authorized that use of force. That matters because of a detail that goes back to that definition I gave you earlier. A blockade is something that is done by a belligerent. Expressed another way, they're an act of aggression or war. What you can see on the right there is a piece that came out soon after the US announcement that expressly brings up this point. It refers to UN experts giving a statement on the legality of a US blockade against Venezuela, saying the following, quote, "A blockade is a prohibited use of military force against another country under Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. It is such a serious use of force that is also expressly recognised as a legal armed aggression under the General Assembly's 1974 definition of aggression," end quote. So by that logic, given the United States doesn't claim to be at war with Venezuela, unless you could make some sort of self-defense case here, for example, a US blockade of Venezuela would probably be in some very interesting legal waters. And it goes some way towards explaining why, historically, the US has often been very, very careful to avoid using the B word. The de facto blockade of Cuba during the missile crisis in 1962, for example, may have been a blockade in parts of the press, a blockade in Soviet statements condemning it, but in US statements, this ring of naval vessels around Cuba to prevent additional Soviet shipments arriving was just a quarantine, partly for propaganda and diplomatic reasons, and partly because the US government was keen to avoid the implication that the US was now in a state of war with Cuba, much as a US blockade of Venezuela might be taken to imply an act of war there. Except there's one small asterisk here. In practice, the US blockade, in inverted commas, doesn't actually look like a blockade. I'll link a few pieces in the description that go into this in more detail, but suffice to say, a lot of the features you'd normally associate with a blockade just don't seem to be present here. You can see one example of this argument being put forward by a professor of international relations on the right there, who runs through a quick checklist of features and then concludes, quote, "What is unfolding is not a classic blockade," end quote. And I'll note that the US hasn't been looking to a state of war to provide legal justification for boarding these tankers, but instead to legal justifications that can apply to any state that wants to go out there and board ships on the high sea, which already exist under international agreements. As an aside, I'd argue that puts the United States strategy here in a bit of an interesting position. On one hand, they might be paying a diplomatic and public perception penalty for using the term blockade and claiming to enforce one. But at the same time, they don't seem to be leaning on the kind of powers that a blockade would give you to justify the ships they're going after. Instead, apparently mostly focusing on vessels where a right to board them might arguably exist, whether you declared a blockade or not. If you want to legally board tankers, you need to look at the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. UNCLOS is, at least for the moment, the closest thing we have to a universal international rulebook on how things are meant to go at sea. It defines things like territorial sea boundaries, the power of countries within their territorial waters, the rights of vessels at sea, and critically for us today, when countries are allowed to board them. While I know all of you would love nothing more than a multi-hour dive into the intricacies of international maritime law, for our purposes, the relevant rules in UNCLOS can be summarised as follows. every ship out there has to be registered to and fly the flag of a nation state. In the modern era, that's usually going to be the flag of somewhere like Liberia, Panama, or the Marshall Islands, which might be a great way of avoiding some of the rules, regulations, and costs that a major state flag might force on you, and also avoiding any domestic law or potential military service liabilities, like having your ship called up for service in time of war, that might come from being registered somewhere like the UK, China, or United States. By default then, in most circumstances, that ship is that nation's responsibility. If that ship is facing security problems, it's the flag nation's problem. If you as nation state have a problem with that ship and it's not in your territorial waters, you take it up with the flag nation. Under normal circumstances, the French can't go out into the Atlantic, see a British flagship and board it without British permission. However, courtesy of Article 110, there are at least 5 exceptions. 1. If a ship is engaged in piracy. 2. If a ship is involved in slave trading. 3. If a ship is involved in unauthorised broadcasting. And then the 2 that are actually interesting to us here. A ship being stateless, so not having a flag nation, or falsely claiming a flag nation. To somewhat oversimplify, if a ship isn't someone's specific responsibility, other countries have considerably more latitude to make it their responsibility. There's also one other rule that's going to become relevant to us in just a moment. It's called the hot pursuit doctrine. Basically, if you start chasing a ship that you're allowed to start chasing, for example, in your territorial waters, and it makes it out to international waters, as long as you continue chasing it, you can continue that pursuit and board it. Which realistically means every film you've ever seen that involves people racing for international waters to get away from the cops should actually have ended with them cheering when they reached international waters, only to then be arrested anyway. As long as the chase is legal when it starts, it doesn't become illegal just because you reach international waters. The rules around this can actually become funnily specific, especially when aircraft get involved in the equation. An aircraft pursuing a ship, for example, has to order it to stop and not leave the location unless another aircraft or ship is able to take over, quote, unless the aircraft is itself able to arrest the ship, end quote, which you have to imagine would usually be impractical, but very interesting to watch. Merchant ships are also generally required to have AIS, Automatic Identification System transponders installed, which can automatically provide things like a ship's position and its identity information to coastal authorities automatically. Going through that list, you can see why, in the absence of a declared blockade, most merchant ship traffic, even to somewhere like Venezuela, should be fine. Those cargo ships hopefully aren't involved in acts of piracy or slave trading, and even if they were to be carrying sanctioned oil, for example, under UNCLOS, that's not enough reason to justify a boarding. But shadow fleet tankers, by their very nature, can get into trouble in all kinds of ways. They might struggle to get or keep an international registration. They have a tendency, as you can imagine, to break the rules with regards to those AIS transponders, and can potentially end up breaching UNCLOS in all kinds of ways, leaving the door open for a ship from a Navy or a Coast Guard to pull up alongside and go knock-knock. With regards to the US grabbing several of these tankers, we've allegedly seen the shadow fleet trip up in a number of ways. In early December, for example, the United States seized the tanker Skipper, previously the Odessa, which had reportedly been sanctioned since 2022 for running Venezuelan and Iranian oil. Under UNCLOS, the Skipper arguably would have been fair game because while it was flying the flag of a nation, Guyana, that allegedly turned out to be bullshit, with Guyana saying the ship was falsely flying its flag and was not actually registered in the country. Flying a false flag is obviously a no-no and makes the ship fair game. And here's the thing. Even if a shadow fleet tanker is legitimately registered with the flag of convenience state, that doesn't necessarily close out the issue, because the flag nation has legal responsibility for the vessel, and critically, can permit others to board it. It's been reported that that's what happened with another tanker, the Centuries, seized by the United States off the Venezuelan coast. Centuries was another vessel with a somewhat storied history, and Venezuela at the time described the seizure as an act of theft and kidnapping and said the acts would not go unpunished, noting that they would file a complaint at the United Nations Security Council, a place where the United States has a veto. Centuries had previously been flagged to Greece and Liberia, but at the time of the seizure was flagged to Panama. The ship itself wasn't on a US sanctions list, but the cargo, Venezuelan oil, was. And the way the US got to it is reportedly by calling up Panama and saying, hey, can we go board this ship? For a lot of reasons that probably don't bear explaining, the Panamanian government appears to have said yes, allowing the boarding to go ahead. Illustrating shadow tanker risk number 2. If you fly a false flag of convenience, you might get boarded, and if you fly an actual flag of convenience, you better hope the country providing that flag is willing to tell Washington to rack off if they call up asking permission to board you. You also need to be sure that your flag of convenience state won't simply kick you off the list as soon as it becomes inconvenient to have you there. In late November, Gambit, knocked a casual 70-odd sanctioned Dark Fleet tankers off its registry, declaring their maritime certificates to be fraudulent. And if you're a Shadow Fleet tanker and your flag provider bumps you off the list at an inconvenient time, that makes you guessed it, stateless and potentially vulnerable. That purge of the Gambian list caught a number of vessels that were in Venezuelan water at the time, including the tankers Hyperion and Premier. Another similar case might be the tanker M. Sophia, which was flying the Panamanian flag, but Panama reportedly knocked the tanker off their registration list in January 2025, opening the way for the United States to board the tanker in early 2026. So while this isn't and can't be a legal evaluation, in reference to at least some of these US seizures, you could argue a number of these Shadow Fleet tankers are falling victim not to acts of piracy, but instead to a combination of creative rules lawyering and someone very much stuffing up on the admin side, with some of these ships having been kicked off their original registers for months by the time the United States went after them, without them successfully managing to find a new, legitimate protective flag in the meantime. I think we can all understand the desire occasionally to not do paperwork, but I imagine if the consequences of not doing your admin was potentially coming face to face with an armed boarding team, most of us would want to at least try and find a way to navigate the bureaucracy. And indeed, as that piece by former Royal Australian Navy officer Jennifer Parker on the right there puts it, this is even less likely to be piracy than it is to merely be illegal. Quote, "In law, piracy has a narrow definition under UNCLOS. It is limited to violent acts carried out for private ends by private vessels on the high sea. Whatever view one takes of the broader US campaign, these boardings do not meet the legal definition of piracy." End quote. However, if we shove the lawyers to a side for a moment and put the defence economics hat on, it is possible to imagine situations that don't match the legal definition of piracy, but which might have similar strategic and economic impacts to piracy. And even if UNCLOS basically says that national navies can't technically be pirates, that doesn't mean, practically, they can't take a few leaves out of the Jack Sparrow playbook. Which brings us to perhaps the most controversial and strategically impactful of the recent US seizures. Let's talk about the seizure of the tanker Bella 1. The Bella 1 story is interesting for a variety of reasons. Namely, it originally told the US no when they demanded to come aboard, and it created an interesting test case via the relationship between Washington and Moscow. For a bit of context here, the Bella was an absolute chonker of a tanker, a very large crude carrier, so deadweight tonnage somewhere between 200 and 320,000 tonnes, implying a capacity of approximately 2 million barrels of crude oil. It also had, shall we say, a very long and storied travel history. What you're seeing on screen here is a rough map of the final journey of the Bella 1 based on its AIS pings, starting in Iran, heading out to the Malacca Straits, and then departing for South America. As the article on the right notes, as the vessel was loitering around Iran, it logged a casual 379 suspicious rendezvous events. What these can sometimes represent is a Shadow Fleet ship or a ship known to be dodgy going into a location, picking up a sanctioned product like oil, bringing it outside of those waters, then meeting up with another ship at sea, doing a cargo transfer, allowing that clean ship, in inverted commas, to carry that cargo to a final destination. If the ship is carrying a partial cargo of unsanctioned oil, for example, it might meet up with a Shadow Fleet tanker, do an at-sea transfer to take on sanctioned oil, mix it in with its existing cargo, and then sell the whole lot somewhere else as unsanctioned oil. At least, allegedly. Bella 1 was also in the habit of hiding so often that you could argue it gave a bit of a clue the ship might have had something to hide. The ship went dark, so it turned off its transponders at least 17 times within Iranian waters alone. It reportedly turned off its AIS 5 times within the exclusive economic zones of Indonesia and Malaysia, again off the coast of Sri Lanka. There were further AIS deactivations near Spain and Portugal. Suffice to say, it was a dodgy journey. Reportedly, on or around the 21st of December, as the ship was getting closer to Venezuela, the United States moved to board the Bella, with the legal justification, as it turns out, being that Bella was flying a false flag, as what might be described as a somewhat bold move. When you're on a slow-moving supertanker, several times the displacement of an aircraft carrier, Bella reportedly told the US to rack off. That did end up buying the Bella 1 some time. While any sufficiently large US Navy or Coast Guard vessel is probably capable of overcoming a supertanker in a boarding action if required, kind of like the maritime equivalent of a SWAT team, there are only a couple of dedicated, trained, heliborne boarding teams out there. Maritime Security Response Teams. If you're a ship and decide you don't want to be boarded the friendly way, they're the teams that can come in and do it the other way. While the US might have been waiting for one of those teams to arrive then, the world got to see a captivating, extremely low-speed chase play out. Until eventually, Bella appears to have taken inspiration from a Grand Theft Auto game where you can pull your car into a paint shop in order to drop your wanted stars, turning off its AIS, only to turn it back on again several days later, reporting that it was no longer the sanctioned Guyana flag tanker Bella 1, it was the totally illegitimate Russian supertanker Marinera. In a super convincing manoeuvre, the crew apparently went so far as to paint a Russian flag on the side of the vessel, although it's not entirely clear from the reporting whether that was just for extra emphasis, or because they legitimately did not have a Russian flag aboard and had to make do with some paint. For any of you who ever saw the film Lord of War, this was basically that manoeuvre. Now the ship was nominally Russian flagged, that would have made it Russia's legal responsibility and placed it de facto under Russian protection. It's reported Moscow actually reached out to Washington, requesting they now discontinue their pursuit of the vessel, since, after all, it was Russian, and they were not giving the US Coast Guard permission to come aboard. It's also reported the Russian Navy sent reinforcements, in particular a submarine, to escort the now Marinera, essentially making a symbolic commitment to the vessel, perhaps hoping the United States would respect the new Russian flag, which they absolutely did not. Submarines might be deadly naval combatants, but given they tend to be relatively small and submerged, they don't do well when it comes to body-blocking boarding attempts. The US simply put its boarding party on helicopters, flew them over to the Bella 1, and then after roughly 2 weeks of pursuit, finally put an end to the chase. The ship was seized without casualties, with the White House claiming that while a Russian submarine and destroyer had been in the area, they, quote, both left very quickly when we arrived, end quote. It's also reported that UK armed forces were actively involved in the operation, with the UK MOD saying that the US had requested and received assistance, including in the form of an RAF surveillance aircraft and a Royal Navy support ship. US military's European command would follow up by thanking the British for their quote-unquote unwavering support during the operation. From a legal perspective, it does seem like the Bella 1 seizure is going to give the lawyers something to talk about for some time. Was the ship properly re-registered in Russia on the fly? Can you re-register a ship that's being pursued because it's believed to be stateless, then turn around to your pursuers and say, too bad, so sad, kind of like someone on the freeway being chased by the cops for driving their car without being registered, only to frantically place a call to the transportation department mid-chase, get it registered, turn around and tell the cops to go away. I don't think it's even entirely clear what exact legal position the United States is taking yet. Was the ship not successfully registered in Russia? Or was it successfully flagged in Russia while still claiming to be a Guyana flag vessel when it wasn't, thus being guilty of flying or switching between two flags at convenience, which is also a no-no? To quote from Article 92, a ship which sails under the flags of two or more states, using them according to convenience, may not claim any of the nationalities in question with respect to any other state, and may be assimilated to a ship without nationality, end quote. AKA, a ship that claims to have two countries effectively has none. But, as at time of recording, it's not entirely clear that's what the United States is actually claiming happened here. And on top of the ambiguity regarding the Bella itself, just to help the clarity of the entire legal process around this even more, after the ship was taken, Secretary Hegseth went on the internet and used the B word, saying that the blockade of sanctioned and illicit Venezuelan oil remains in full effect anywhere in the world, end quote. So yeah, if you're a maritime lawyer specialising in this field, I imagine it's an interesting time. From a strategic perspective, though, the outcome is fairly clear. Despite Russia claiming to put the Bella, or Marinera, under its protection, it's currently under US control and anchored in Scotland. Something which, given the, as you can see, dismal state of the vessel, probably isn't winning it any fans among the locals. Russia didn't get what it wanted in the form of the US not boarding and seizing the vessel, and furthermore later announced its gratitude when the United States announced that Russian members of the crew would be allowed to go free. That leaves the United States with the tanker, Russia with the crew, and perhaps a little bit of a bruised naval ego. So before we get into the more strategic implications of this more active phase of collecting sanctioned tankers like their Pokemon, I do think it's worth flagging where things currently stand with the Venezuelan quote-unquote blockade and where they might be going next. Through January, the first response for many sanctioned tankers in Venezuelan waters was to scatter, sometimes switch their flags, and run. One imagines the hope must have been that if enough ships tried to make a break for it in many different directions at the same time, the United States might not have had enough assets in the region to chase them all down. The main problem with this, of course, is that oil tankers are not exactly speedboats. Some of them are going to be the size or larger than supercarriers, but you can bet they don't have a nuclear propulsion system running them through the water at 30 knots. And so for many of these vessels, we had an incredibly gripping, very low-speed chase that ended one of three ways. The US grabbed the vessel, it made it through the cordon, or in many cases, it gave up and turned back for Venezuelan waters. For some reason, I did see some media reports claiming that tankers deciding to turn back to Venezuelan waters rather than run through the cordon of US ships somehow represented a defeat of the American effort. If the objective of this operation was to make it more difficult for ships to actively trade in sanctioned oil, Trading stuff usually requires a ship be able to, leave port and go somewhere else. So for any ships that made it through and elsewhere, that's one thing. While for those that are effectively trapped, they're running up costs for their owners every day without being able to do much other than serve as very expensive, slightly offshore storage. The US intention here, in line with some of the statements we've previously seen from the White House, appears to be to pressure Venezuela into turning the task of selling and shipping their oil over to US firms. Reportedly, a small fleet of tankers booked by US firm Chevron is on their way to the country, with the apparent goal being able to ramp up the amount of Venezuelan oil being shipped out. Remember, Chevron is currently the only Western firm allowed to produce and export oil from Venezuela, which likely puts it in a better position than the rest of the oil majors to move quickly, if the goal is to rapidly shift Venezuela's oil cargoes from the shadow fleet to big oil. There's also, so far, no indication the US intends to dial back on its boarding efforts. Having seized 6 oil tankers at time of recording, Reuters reports the US government has filed warrants to seize dozens more. Which brings us to the big way, beyond the United States just getting into the tanker collection game, that the entire tanker war and tug over the shadow fleet appears to be changing. And it all comes back to what flags these ships are choosing to fly. For a long time, the chosen tactic for a lot of shadow fleet ships was to try and, at least legally, be as stealthy as possible. Many may have looked to registries where the level of regulatory oversight might not always have been up to the same level you might see elsewhere. Think Gabon, the Cook Islands, Barbados, Palau, Gambia, Sierra Leone, San Marino. But as those flag states came under increasing pressure to clean up their registries, so to speak, a lot of shadow fleet ships were already finding themselves with legally nowhere obvious to go. As the article on the right put it, quote, tankers then turned to approximately 18 fraudulent registries that the International Maritime Organization determined did not exist, rendering the vessels falsely flagged and stateless, end quote. What we are now seeing instead is a lot of these ships cast off the legal disguise, so to speak, and openly flagging themselves to Russia. Tactically speaking, for shadow fleet vessels, you could argue that's a bit of a trade-off. On one hand, it's kind of hard to argue you're not part of the shadow fleet and have nothing to do with the likes of Russia, Iran or Venezuela if you have a giant Russian flag painted on the side of your ship. At that point, it isn't really even a shadow fleet, so to speak, it's just an extension of the Russian merchant navy. If your job is to track and identify these vessels, then them openly identifying as Russian probably makes your job significantly easier. What it does do, though, legally and diplomatically, is set up much more of a standoff. It's one thing to say things might have been a tad hazy with the Bella, which tried to become Russian while actively being pursued with its transponder off, but in a lot of these other cases that have more time to prepare, the registration's going to be clear-cut. Russia does have the right to flag merchant ships. It also then has the right to tell other countries not to board them. And with the number of ships in that situation rapidly shifting, it's reported the Russian ship register has increased by roughly 40% since the invasion of Ukraine back in February 2022. How and if the United States and its allies are willing to pressure these vessels that are openly acting in Russia's interest remains to be seen. If they do nothing, it might make sanctions increasingly porous. If they act despite the Russian registrations, then the legal and diplomatic consequences are hard to assess with absolute certainty. But what I think is certain is that ships that are openly flying the Russian flag may well become targets for an actor out there that's all too willing to touch Russia's boats and probably isn't keen to ask permission. Let's talk about Ukraine's role here. While a lot of focus has been on US actions in the Caribbean or Atlantic, the Ukrainians have been very active pressing Russian naval logistics, especially in the Black Sea. There was a time where a tanker being hit by a drone in the Black Sea would be major international news, and for bonus points, you might have seen a discussion about escalation risk and whether World War III was now inevitable. Now, though, an event like this is just Tuesday, or in the case of the attack on this ship, the Elbis, a Wednesday. The ship was reportedly about 30 miles off the Turkish coast, so outside Turkish territorial waters, on the way to the Russian port of Novorossiysk at the time the attack happened. At time of recording, Ukraine hasn't confirmed the attack, but the ship was reportedly hit by a drone and forced to turn back into Turkish waters for an inspection by the Turkish Coast Guard. Elbis was far from the first tanker to be attacked in this kind of way, and it's unlikely to be the last. Back in late November, we actually saw 2 tankers struck in the same region at the same time. The Kairos, which was reportedly disabled, and the Virat, which was hit but remained stable. We've also seen the Ukrainians appear to constantly extend their geographical reach. There was a successful drone attack on a ship in the Mediterranean, which the Ukrainians claimed, and another recent attack on January 13th, which hit multiple tankers at the same time. That attack particularly was interesting and deserves a little bit of further investigation, because in this case, the ships were hit near a Russian port, yes, but specifically near a terminal for the Caspian Pipeline Consortium. That's the export terminal for a pipeline that travels across Russian territory all the way to oil fields in Kazakhstan. mean that while Russia uses that pipeline and export terminal, a lot of that volume is going to be coming from a third-party state. Reportedly in 2025, Kazakhstan exported about 47 million tonnes of oil via the system, while Russia exported around 28 million tonnes. If this is a Ukrainian drone attack then, it might raise a couple of possibilities. Maybe this was a case of misidentification, or the Ukrainians have an open policy of targeting tankers heading to Russian ports. Or alternatively, the Ukrainians are focused on diminishing Russia's ability to export oil and are willing to risk endangering exports from third-party countries via Russia in order to accomplish that goal. Whatever the case, I bring up some of these recent attacks to illustrate a few core points. Ukraine is clearly willing to go after ships linked to the Russian oil trade. They have a reach that extends at minimum through the Black Sea, and in one case into the Mediterranean, and from a technical and tactical perspective, one of the more worrying elements here might be just how easy it appears to be. Russia appears to be struggling to deal with attacks by relatively simple Ukrainian drone systems, even in an area of water, the Black Sea, where traditionally it's perceived to be the dominant naval power. These attacks aren't happening in the Arctic Ocean. In some cases, they're occurring within literal line of sight of Russian military ports. That backs up something I've repeatedly observed about the Houthi efforts in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb. They were a seriously asymmetric actor that was hopelessly, hilariously out-teched and outgunned. But especially in an era of cheap and accessible drone and missile systems, kinetically disrupting civilian maritime traffic appears to be very easy and protecting it very hard. Which does leave one wondering, if it's this easy for a weaker actor to accomplish this level of disruption against a stronger one, what would ever happen if the asymmetry was reversed, and it was the stronger actor trying to kinetically disrupt trade, while the weaker one tried to hold it all together? Not a key consideration for the topic today, but something to keep in mind if you're mulling certain future strategic scenarios. Now, to zoom out a bit though, you might be looking at these events and going, hey, these are obviously very dramatic cases, but at the end of the day, the quantities here are relatively small in the grand scheme of things. Less than 10 Venezuelan tankers seized so far by the United States. Ukraine's still in the double digits in terms of overall hits, against a shadow fleet, even if you're just counting the bigger stuff, of perhaps maybe 1,000 vessels overall. On one hand, that's true, but it also misses a very important aspect to the analysis here: economics. International shipping is very much a game where margin matters. The more you have to pay to transport your cargo, the more you have to pay to insure your cargo, the less headspace you have to actually generate a profit margin. For a lot of cargoes then, that can mean that even a relatively small risk, if it's potentially catastrophic enough, can be enough to shift the math a bit. If you think of a generic attacker versus defender scenario, and I'd argue the tanker war qualifies as one, there's at least one factor I'd suggest you can normally look to for at least a clue as to who's got the easier or more difficult position. All else being equal, the one that's closer to requiring perfection is going to have the harder time of it. If you're defending your country against potential missile attack, and your requirement is that you have to stop every missile from hitting every potentially strategically valuable target in your country, you might find yourself bankrupted quickly due to the sheer number of defensive installations and interceptors you might need. The attacker is free to concentrate against whatever the weakest point of your defense is perceived to be, throw everything they have at it, and so you need to build up your capabilities to the point that that doesn't happen. On the flip side, if the win condition for the attacker requires them to hit all of their targets, then suddenly they're the ones that need to have the massively overbuilt force. How does that concept relate to shipping and interdiction? Basically, I'd argue there are cargo types where the shipper wins as long as they can get at least some of their cargoes through, whereas in other cases, for the economics to work, they need to get just about everything through. Some examples of the types of goods where some success might be enough success are probably intuitive enough. You're looking at stuff where the profit margin or strategic value is very high, stuff that is generally compact, and so potentially going to be relatively high in value compared to the cost of the platform you're risking to ship it. When Iran was trying to ship weapons to the Houthis, for example, they probably considered a win, even if a lot of those shipments were intercepted. Because if you ship $10 million worth of drone components, 3 million of them arrive, and the Houthis then use them to achieve $500 million worth of strategic impact, then sure, the embargo had a significant impact, but not enough to make it not worth doing in the first place. A lot of international criminal smuggling works on that same logic. If your shipping costs are low enough and your profit margins for the product high enough, you're going to keep doing it even if a percentage of your products are regularly detected and seized. And in the case of some commodities that are near universally restricted, the more shipments are successfully intercepted, the wider the gap might be between supply and demand, and thus the higher prices you might see for the stuff that actually does make it onto the market. In other cases, for the shipper, it might not really be about the costs at all, just an outright strategic imperative. During the Second World War, for example, Britain had a pretty strong motivation to A, not starve, and B, be able to continue operating its war industries. That meant that even if a lot of stuff was lost in the Atlantic to U-boat attacks, it was still worth shipping it because there was no strategic alternative. Oil, however, is not the kind of thing you can ship on a narco sub, and the math for losing a ship to seizure looks very different. Imagine you have a tanker looking to transport sanctioned oil. Let's say that to ship a cargo, whoever owns that ship is risking a $30 million asset. Let's say 600,000 barrels of crude aboard at about $50 a barrel means whoever owns that oil is up for about $30 million worth of cargo. If the shipment succeeds, both sides are up for a profit margin. That might be the transport fee to the owner of the ship for the oil, or the profit margin on the sale of the product. But if the ship is seized, they both potentially lose everything. If, for example, you're in a situation where secretly a Russian company owns both, it's their oil they're trying to sell, and they de facto own the tanker, you can imagine a scenario where you might be risking $60 million worth of product and asset in order to make a couple of $1 million profit. Which means even if the odds of being intercepted might only be 5%, you still might see your effective profit margin for the effort overall get slashed in half. If it rises too high, the whole exercise might not be worth doing in the first place. You might legitimately be better off not pumping the barrels in the first place, if that's an option. The basic problem here is that the margins on the product you're trying to sell, sanctioned oil, generally just aren't going to be very high relative to the cost of producing that oil and the tanker required to move them. To be somewhat effective then, the Americans and the Ukrainians don't need to hit every Shadow Fleet vessel. Every incident makes this a riskier exercise and imposes additional costs on the system. It'd be unlikely to stop it entirely, because as long as Russia and Venezuela have oil they desperately need to convert into currency, they need to find a way to sell it somewhere. But it's going to eat into margins, for shippers that might be interested in the trade to potentially look for a different business opportunity, and in the case of Venezuela, the United States might be hoping it convinces them to discard this approach entirely, opting to sell their oil via Washington rather than using the Shadow Fleet. So whatever the legality of the manoeuvre might be, in purely hard power terms, at least for the moment, it appears to have had a significant impact on Venezuela's ability to export oil via the Shadow Fleet, which raises questions as to whether the United States might intend to repeat this methodology elsewhere, and also some of the other factors that might inform how things go from here. The first is to what extent we see other nations beyond just the United States get even more proactive in targeting the Shadow Fleet. Ultimately, the US Navy and Coast Guard just can't have coverage everywhere. A lot of key international ports aren't under their jurisdiction. And so if the goal is to maximise the reach and effect of an effort, you really want multiple countries to be involved. Just in the last couple of days at time of recording, we've seen a couple of relevant cases hit the media. Russian state media has complained about the Italian government seizing not an oil tanker but a cargo ship, which was reportedly in this case brave enough to carry a cargo of 33,000 tonnes of metals from the port of Novorossiysk into a southern Italian port. If that reporting is accurate, I think we can classify that as a bold move, which ultimately doesn't appear to have paid off. It's also been reported the UK government thinks it's identified a legal basis which could be used to allow the Royal Navy to board and detain Shadow Fleet vessels, and as mentioned earlier, we did see British cooperation in the seizure of the Bella 1. If you're a country that relies on the Shadow Fleet operating effectively, the more of this kind of cooperation you see, the more dangerous and difficult the situation might become. But the reality, of course, is that none of this is taking place in a vacuum. And arguably, just as we're at a point in this tanker campaign where cooperation between allies could be extremely valuable, the transatlantic relationship in particular is looking to be under serious strain. The confrontation over Greenland, for example, that we'll need to talk about in the near future, appears to have escalated from being primarily grounded in rhetoric to one where the United States is now announcing new tariffs on European allies and threatening to raise those tariffs even further, unless or until Denmark agrees to sell Greenland to the United States, despite the fact Denmark has said the territory is not for sale, and polling has pretty clearly indicated that the vast majority of people living in Greenland do not want to become part of the United States. It's a near-constant historical reality that international relations are often messy. Countries might be clashing over one issue while still having incentives to cooperate in other places. But I think it's going to be very interesting to see whether the degree of cooperation we might have expected in the past is still going to be possible in a situation where you have these kind of threats and tensions in play. The other big what if is to what extent reflagging a lot of these ships as Russian is actually going to provide protection in practice. That's partly a legal question, but also a practical one. So far, reportedly at least, a lot of these US seizures rely on gaps in the legal status of the Shadow Fleet, false or dual flagging, or situations where the flag state will give permission for a search. But as was very clearly the case with the Bella 1, in situations where there is a clash between Washington and Moscow over whether a particular boarding would be legal, practically speaking, there are pretty severe limits on Russia's ability to do anything about it. Meaning an open question here is how much are powers like the United States willing to leverage hard power against the Shadow Fleet even if it means adopting some very creative legal arguments in the process. Because above all, the effective functioning of the Shadow Fleet effectively requires that countries like the United States and its various European and Asian allies essentially follow their own rules, at least for the most part. That might be a reasonable default assumption a lot of the time, but as recent history shows, countries are often more than capable of selectively bending or ignoring parts of international law when they see a strategic imperative to do so. In any case, in terms of how the story might evolve from here, I think there are a couple of different points to watch. Because you have to remember, a lot of the elements we might take for granted about the way international shipping currently works are really relatively modern inventions. Low-cost flags of convenience, for example, where merchant ships can register with countries like Guyana or Panama, really weren't a reality in the first part of the 20th century. The overwhelming majority of merchant ships were flagged to a major power, and that major power in turn was responsible for their protection. I've got an extract from a news article on the right there going into 1914, claiming that at the time, Great Britain had a merchant fleet of about 20 million tonnes, Germany 5 million, the US 3.5, Norway 2.5 million tonnes, followed by France, Japan and Italy. Going into the Second World War, Britain's overall dominance in that area had reduced, but the practice of flagging to major powers hadn't, and in any case, about a third of the world's merchant ships were still British at the time. Before World War I, international trade is still obviously incredibly massive business, but the idea you could fly a flag of a microstate and enjoy free passage across the world's oceans would have seemed about as strange to many commentators in 1910 as the idea of the US randomly yoinking tankers might seem to us now. Somewhat ironically given recent events, it was the United States that was actually key in pushing for freedom of the seas to become an international legal concept. After the First World War, President Woodrow Wilson pushed it as one of his 14 points, essentially arguing that ships should enjoy freedom of navigation on the open seas as long as they were outside territorial waters and weren't breaching any kind of international agreement. That actually turned out to be a very unifying proposal from the United States, with Britain, France, and Germany opposing it. That might have worked after World War I, where Britain and France were still major powers, the US was still on the up, and Germany, while exhausted, was still at least mostly intact. But after World War II, things looked different. The US Navy had reached truly ludicrous size, most other economies around the world were exhausted, and so after a series of agreements and negotiations through the 50s, 60s and 70s, eventually in 1982, we got the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. That expressly enshrined the idea that the high seas are open to all states, whether coastal or landlocked, and established specific freedoms for naval traffic, both military and civilian. In some ways, you could argue the United States was both a major beneficiary and advocate of those concepts. Freedom of navigation meant that US warships could freely transit the world and project power. It meant that trade could thrive, costs could come down. And over the years, we've seen the US and some other navies keep up a steady drumbeat of so-called freedom of navigation operations, where essentially you sail a bunch of ships through an area simply to assert the fact that you can. If, for example, a country is claiming what you believe to be international waters as its own territorial waters, then you might freedom of navigate a destroyer, a cruiser, or an entire carrier battle group through that area, and as you're smiling and waving, implicitly dare them to do something about it, if they're so serious about their claim. There is, however, a giant asterisk over this whole system of maritime law, UNCLOS, and the historic role of the US Navy in occasionally backing it. For all the talk about the rules-based international order and all the debates around where these boarding activities are actually UNCLOS compliant, at the end of the day, the US has never actually signed it. There's a lot of historical trivia that goes into why, and there have been several domestic US pushes over the years to try and get that to change. But to summarise the position given by the Office of the Staff Judge Advocate over at Indo-PACOM in 2021, despite being a major participant in the negotiations for it, the United States didn't sign the convention when it opened up for signature in 1982, initially, at least in part, because they objected to some of the provisions relating to deep seabed mining in areas beyond the continental shelf. As such, the US ended up adopting a kind of halfway position. Quote, "Following adoption of the convention in 1982, it's been the policy of the United States to act in a manner consistent with its provisions relating to traditional uses of the ocean and to encourage other countries to do likewise." It goes on to say that therefore, although the United States did not sign UNCLOS, it recognised the convention contains provisions with respect to traditional use of the ocean that generally confirm existing maritime law and practice and fairly balance the interests of all states. End quote. Essentially, the US follows many of the provisions of UNCLOS and encourages other countries, sometimes quite forcefully, to do the same. But they're not traditionally bound by the agreement in the way that most other countries around the world are. And what that means, even if we might consider it unlikely, is the option is always open for US administrations to reinterpret how the country has historically engaged with these provisions and how the United States Navy chooses to engage with ships at sea, with all the potential implications that might have for other powerful naval nations who might be potentially looking to US actions as a precedent for them to potentially follow. That's potentially where the longer-term global implications of this could potentially be at their most extreme. So much of our international economic system is based on, by historical standards, relatively cheap, relatively accessible, and relatively free ocean navigation. From the energy resources that power our countries, to the food that feeds populations, to all of the inputs that feed complex multinational supply chains around the world, so much of global economic prosperity is tied in our ability to put stuff on ships and move it from point A to point B. And that makes any change, on paper or in practice, to the rules governing international trade and oceanic navigation something that economists and strategic planners in countries around the world are going to be watching very, very closely. Which brings us pretty neatly, I think, to the conclusion. Who, at least so far, are the winners and losers of this recent escalation in the tanker war? Some of the strategic losers are, I'd argue, fairly clear and not overly controversial. The Rodriguez government in Caracas, for example, arguably finds itself under even more immense military, political and economic pressure. Even with the benefit of oil sales via the shadow fleet, Venezuela was in a state of economic meltdown. Now, with that export mechanism being squeezed, and the United States having demonstrated that it's willing and able to project military power into the country itself, Caracas is probably going to be under immense pressure to accept Washington's offer to place more of their exports under US control. Iran is perhaps not as directly in the line of fire as Venezuela is, but its economic interests here are also acute. Like Venezuela, Iran is going through a deep-seated economic crisis, and its existing government is incredibly unpopular. The country has recently been racked by enormous protests, reportedly resulting in thousands of people being killed, and one imagines that for the regime in Tehran, they're just happy that the United States, unlike in Venezuela, hasn't stepped in to take direct military action. But even if the current crackdown is allowed to progress to its natural and, in humanitarian terms, incredibly costly conclusion, Iran remains desperately reliant on its ability to export oil, including via the shadow fleet, for even a modicum's hope of economic survival. If transport costs go up, or shipping volumes become more constrained, then that will be yet one more economic pressure that the already overstretched state finances are going to have to find a way to deal with. Economically, the impact on Russia is much less immediate than the other two. The Russians have greater financial resources and they have more options. But they also face the distinct source of pressure, Ukraine's kinetic sanctions, and by acknowledging and flagging more and more shadow fleet vessels openly as Russian, they're also potentially setting the stage for further open confrontations with the US or European powers. The incident with the Bella 1 arguably highlighted that when push comes to shove, Russia's ability to project power in these situations is arguably fairly limited. And so ultimately, how effective this new strategy of openly flagging tankers as Russian turns out to be is probably at least partly going to be determined by how other countries with the relevant sticks choose to respond to it. Meaning whether all of this ultimately proves to be a massive barrier to the shadow fleet, or just an impetus for it to evolve into a much more open Russian asset, as is often the case, only time will tell. And okay, channel update to close out. Originally the plan had been to cover this topic, the tanker war, in the same episode that covered the Maduro operation. It didn't take particularly long for me to work out though that there was a lot of material there, and the two episodes probably needed to be split up. The third part of that mini-series, if you like, is still in the cooker, covering the United States' new security strategy, the rebirth of the Monroe Doctrine, and in particular what some of the threats and confrontations linked to that over places like Mexico and Greenland might be fundamentally changing in terms of the American and European security environment. I'm not sure whether that episode will be coming out next week or the week after, because there's also an episode on Ukraine in the works, and if the first part of 2026 is anything to go by, there's always a chance that something dramatic happens and the whole plan gets canned anyway. In the meantime though, patrons, your first update of 2026 should be posted by the time this video goes live, so feel free to check it out, and there will be a follow-up in the near future. While for those of you over on the other channel, I hope you're enjoying Terra Invicta. There'll be a few more updates next week, but as it is, thank you very much for watching and engaging as always. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and with any luck, I hope to see you all again next week.